Welcome to the Better Sex Podcast. My name is Deborah Catt, and I am your shameless host. This is the Better Sex Podcast, where we have unfiltered conversations about sex and relationships. These conversations are frank and often can be a little bit on the, shall we say, raw and open side. So they may not be appropriate for all ears. So I invite you to listen with care. So I truly believe that a sexy world helps to create a happy and a healthy world. So if you want to do your part in creating a happy and healthy and sexy world, please like, subscribe, and comment wherever you get your podcasts. So excited. Today we are going to dive into the world of Mel Cassidy. They are a queer, multidisciplinary somatic practitioner, a relationship coach who works with queer and questioning people, seeking to have liberating relationships and focusing on honest and consensual non-monogamy. I am really excited for this conversation. Mel, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me here.
So that is kind of the official bio. But what I'm most curious about is what's your story? How did you get here?
Oh, goodness. How did I get here? How did I get to being a somatic practitioner, coaching non-monogamy with the queer community?
Why, yes, as a matter of fact.
I mean, I think there's three parts of that journey. One is the somatic piece, another is the relationship coaching piece, and the third is the non-monogamy piece. So the non-monogamy piece, I had always, I think, had an inkling towards wanting to love multiple people, even as a kid, and a lot of kids are making up their make-believe stories. A lot of little girls are like, I'm going to be a princess and one day my prince will come along. No, I was making up stories where I had 3 princes who I was married to until my mother told me no, it doesn't work that way. So I think the evidence is there that even from a young age, there was some part of me that was drawn towards multiple partnerships. And even in high school, I had an on-off relationship with someone that continued even when they were dating somebody else officially. And I mean, it's high school. We don't know how to handle those things when we're teenagers, at least not in the 90s. And so it wasn't honest, non-monogamy. Certainly not everyone knew. But it was one of those experiences that told me there's a level to which I don't feel like I have ownership over my partners. I don't want to have ownership over them. I don't want to control what they do, and I don't want to be controlled over what I do. But then after university, I was like, okay, I have to be a successful grown-up now. And the partner I had at the time proposed to me. And so I was like, I guess this is what you do. You get married. And I was firmly on that relationship escalator, which, is that linear model of okay, you meet someone, you get married, one day you're going to have kids, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we got married, and I didn't really know what I was doing. I still really didn't know how to be in relationships. I was only 22. And that relationship did not work out. Is the long story short. But during the course of that relationship, we had a few conversations where I said, look, I think I'm bisexual. I think I'm attracted to women too. And he was like, well, yeah, sure. We can explore that. I wouldn't mind that. And I was like, yeah, but I might also want to be with other genders or other men. And he was not okay with that. And several years into the relationship, it became very clear that there was a lot of mutual compromise happening. We were compromising too much to be together. And so we amicably went our separate ways. And that was my opportunity to just dive right into non-monogamy and explore what is this for me. And I had a friend who'd introduced me to the word polyamory. I started to explore that. And at the time, this is the early 2010s, a lot of the non-monogamous people I was encountering were looking at it from this like primary partnership to begin with perspective. And so I was coming in without a primary partner. And there was this assumption that either I was going to be like what's called a secondary or maybe a unicorn, or I was looking for a primary. And I was like, no, I don't want to. I don't like any of those options. I'm not looking to have a new primary partner anytime soon. I just kind of did that. I want something different for a while. And so I made the decision to be my own primary partner. And I decided to do that for 2 years as an experiment and then revisit it. And at the end of those 2 years, I was like, I kind of like this. I kind of like this being my own primary partner and being able to connect with others in whatever way feels authentic and real. And I had started to come across the language of relationship anarchy. And I found that that really integrated well into what I was doing because in relationship anarchy, you're not looking at prioritizing sexual or romantic relationships over friendships. My friendships are incredibly important to me. And so my non monogamy became this journey of how do I create a whole ecosystem of relationships? And along the way, people were asking me for advice. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Have you looked? Everything's a mess. Why are you asking me for advice? And so I eventually went back to school and got a certification for counseling for relationships. But I felt like that wasn't quite enough. And I had a background as a body worker. So I'd been around the language of somatics and mind, body, heart, spirit connection for a really long time. And so, a few years ago, I went back into deepening my studies of somatics and bringing that into my coaching practice because I really feel that in non-monogamy, there's so much happening. And I think a lot of people feel intimidated by how much is going on. A lot of people feel scared to let go of monogamy, even when they do want to let go of it. It can feel scary. And I think that there's a lot in somatic practices that can help support us to actually go into non-monogamy in a good way, in a way that we're not harming others or causing harm to ourselves, that we can be more grounded and more connected and I think have a much more rewarding time.
Thank you. I'm curious hearing that. What is it that you think is so challenging to let go of when it comes to non monogamy?
Yeah. I mean, look at how we grow up with messages around relationships, right? It's in the fairy tale stories we read as kids. It's in the movies we see growing up. It's in the romantic comedies, right? It permeates culture. And, in the last 20 years, we've also had a lot of the celebrity nicknames where it's like they're going to combine the names together. There's this message of like, to be a successful grown up, you have to be part of a couple, right? There's a kind of social privilege we experience when we're part of a couple. And a lot of that rests on the idea that that couple is exclusive. So as soon as we start exploring, well, what is it like to be non-exclusive? There's a lot of stories that can come up, right? Within the monogamous paradigm, really the only modeling for a non-exclusive relationship is cheating. And cheating is seen as like a disaster. It's a crisis. It's the beginning of the end. It means they don't like you. It means there's no trust, right? It's a huge rupture. And, when we come into non-monogamy and the only context we have for understanding multi-partner relationships is from monogamy, is from that cheating paradigm.
Mm-hmm.
We start exploring multiple partnerships. We start dating people who have multiple partners. And I think the alarm bells go off, not because there's necessarily real danger in front of us, but because the only framework we have for understanding what's happening is a framework that says this is dangerous and you're losing things, right? Monogamy is how you're going to find safety and security and stability. The nuclear family is the most important thing and you have to support that model or else. And as soon as we challenge that, I think it's scary. We don't know what's going on. We kind of feel like we lose our footing unless we have a framework, unless we have support to be able to make that transition from the monogamous mindset to the non-monogamous mindset.
So hearing you say that, I'm curious. Do you are there any good cultural, um, sort of stories or movies or around what successful non-monogamy could look like?
So, what's interesting is if we actually go into cultural traditions,
Mhm.
pre colonial traditions, many traditions around the world practice non monogamy in different forms. And a lot of the wisdom of those experiences, a lot of the stories have been erased by colonialism. Like if you go into South Asia, right, in the stories of the Mahabharata, there's multiple examples of non-monogamy, and also in the Ramayana. Um, you go into the Middle East through Arabia and the Levant, even in pre-Islamic Arabia, there's evidence of polygamous and polygynous marriages where even a woman could take multiple husbands, right? And a lot of this information has just been kind of buried or put aside, or it's just not talked about. Again, through many different parts of Africa, same thing. In North America, a lot of indigenous First Nations groups practice forms of non monogamy. They were coerced out of it by the colonial powers. Professor Kim Tallbear talks about this, about how monogamy was imposed on First Nations as part of the colonial agenda, because they wanted to disrupt the community relationships, right? By disrupting community relationships, they were able to hold more power over people. Became harder for people to rise in resistance.
Hearing you say that, it makes me think about, we used to have a whole lot more extended family,
Yeah.
and we used to have a lot more, familial and community support, and that's not what we do so much anymore,
Yeah.
and I think there's a few different reasons for that. I'm curious what you would say about it.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I wonder if the interest towards non-monogamy that we've seen, I think, growing over the last maybe 200 years in modern times, if there's something about that that is a response to the loss of extended kinship networks and extended family. I mean, I think whenever you see people displaced, migrations, immigration, wars, refugees, so on and so forth, but also when we see people colonizing, there's a loss of relationship. We lose the land we were born on. We lose the people we grew up with. Like we may not stay in connection with them. But I think that inherently as human beings, we are wired for connection, right? And attachment theory, a lot of those tests were based on like, oh, an infant has one or two primary caregivers, but that's not how human beings evolved. We evolved in villages. We evolved with a lot of extended family, intergenerational family. And so an infant that grows up with lots of other adults around them experiences a different way of being in the world because and this is me getting a little bit nerdy about the nervous system here. But as we grow from infancy, the more safe relationship and connection we have around us, the more access to our ventral vagal system we grow. And when we come in, the more access to our ventral vagal system we have, the more resilient we are in the face of adversity. And I think very few of us have had the kind of relationality we needed as children, but that doesn't mean we can't still develop it as adults. And so I think as adults, when we're drawn to doing, even if it's not in a non monogamous setting, but I think of like, retreats where we get to explore a lot of emotional vulnerability, where we are exploring our sexuality, all of that is bringing us into more ventral vagal connection. And if that environment is safe enough, if that environment is well held, if there is a good container, if there are healthy boundaries, that can really support us in developing more nervous system resilience, which we need to face all the uncertainties of living as a human being on this planet.
Absolutely. So, because you brought it up, I'm curious if you could, for people who may not be familiar with the system, with the ventral vagal system, can you? I know that's a big ask, but a very short, just description of what that is and why it's so important.
Yeah. So when we look at the nervous system, at least at the autonomic nervous system, I like to think of it as like channels of electricity, channels for energy in our body. And our nervous system is constantly putting energy in different measures into different parts of the nervous system based on what's happening. If we're late for work and we're running to catch the train, there's going to be a lot of energy going through our sympathetic nervous system because that helps us to mobilize. It shuts down our digestion so we can put more energy into our muscles and we can be more alert of like, where's the traffic coming from? Which way is the train, right? All those things. When we're exhausted, when we're really stressed out, when it's been a long day, when we're just like, I need to shut off from the world, our nervous system is putting all of its energy into what's called the dorsal vagal, which is the back part of the nervous system. And that's all about rest. That's all about um, recouping our energy. I think of it as like, when you've got too much happening on your computer and your computer freezes up and you're like, okay, maybe it's time for me to shut the computer down and let it cool down for a bit, right? That's when that part of the nervous system is more active. But then the ventral vagal, that's when our nervous system feels really warm and safe and engaged. And so then the energy is coming through the front part of our nervous system. So it's invigorating our visceral organs. It's invigorating our face. And we might notice that because we feel really curious
Mm.
about the world around us, or we feel curious about other people, or we might feel a sense of playfulness, or we might feel a sense of joy, right? There's a felt sensation to that. And it's entirely possible to feel like I'm very curious and I'm also tired
Mhm.
because it's not a like all the energy goes in one system. I can feel very curious, but also be like, oh my goodness, I'm late for the next meeting. Um, but yeah, the ventral vagal system is really how we grow relationship, and I always think of it as like this front part of ourselves is so vulnerable, right? And I think of like animals. Not all animals are going to let you pet their belly,
Right.
right? They only let the people they really really trust do that. And so when I think of that in terms of us as human beings, we only really open that space up to the people that we feel a degree of safety with. And the more safety we feel with someone, the more trust we experience with someone, the more we might be able to open up into that. And there's a net impact of that, which is more energy is going through our visceral organs, which can be great for our physical health too.
And I imagine that it also adds to our turn on and our
Oh, yes.
oh,
Our genitals are part of the ventral vagal system. Yeah.
it's such a great thank you for that because it's one of the most concise descriptions that's easy, I think, to understand why we would want to cultivate, you know, the nervous system and especially be able to connect, with our front selves.
Yeah.
That
And
it
and when there's shame around that, I mean, I think even like when I was married, there were times where I was attracted to somebody and I felt like there was no space for me to even be curious about my own attraction.
Mhm.
And so it felt like what I was doing was putting a lid on how much I was actually accessing this front part of myself, this part of my nervous system that is relational. And over time that just it felt like I was kind of more and more buried away. And so to even just have the spaciousness to be curious, right? To explore what is it like to connect. Maybe that's sexual, maybe it's not, but like to explore the possibilities of that is really supporting more relationality. So I feel like when we feel like we have to hold ourselves away from acknowledging what we're feeling and what we're curious about, it kind of cascades us into more repression, more repression, more repression, which is not going to be healthy in the long term.
Yeah. Well, and as you're saying that, I'm thinking about, there's such a range of non-monogamy.
Yeah.
I've got clients who their version of non-monogamy is to be able to flirt and connect and maybe even hug and touch people that are not their primary person, all the way up to having multiple um, independent relationships,
Yeah.
and everything in between. And so I find it so, and it's such a personal experience. But if we don't have that permission, if we don't give ourselves permission and we don't give those around us support and approval around the exploration, it just doesn't go anywhere. And
Yeah.
what happens is the shame piece. And I know that it's been my experience with so many of my clients that it's like they don't even understand how deep the shame goes
Yeah.
or how much it holds them back.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think when it comes to like, exploring that spectrum of non-monogamy, there are so many options. And I think people can sometimes also get caught in the like, what if I'm not doing this the right way? I don't know if you've seen that. Like
Oh,
they're looking for the one right way to do it that's not going to cause any problems. It's going to be totally fine for everybody.
Yeah. Well, my partner and I have been sort of in the non-monogamous, well, place for, our whole relationship. And I have certainly gone through the like, what does it mean to be a good poly woman? Or,
Uh-huh.
and what does that mean around jealousy? What does that mean around boundaries? And it's such a trap.
It is. Well, and that comes from that sense of perfectionism, right? And I think perfectionism is something that sabotages us no matter what kind of way we're relating. And there's so much of that comes in from, I think, like there's colonial standards that also like come in of like, here's the way to be in partnership, right? We see that in a lot of religious spaces. There's some kind of prescription for what a good relationship is. And regardless of whether we subscribe to that or not, we internalize there's some kind of model perfect person out there that I have to emulate and be like. And I find myself always reminding people that they're like, whose standards are you going by? Right? We need to go by our own standards. Are you being compassionate? Are
Mhm.
you able to hold space for yourself and the other person? Are you able to meet them collaboratively, or are you trying to have power over or surrendering your power away? Right? This is what matters. Um, but yeah, the perfectionist piece can really hold a lot of us back.
Somebody said, and this has really stuck with me, is this idea that perfectionism is another word for scarcity.
Yeah.
And, one of the things I see a lot is people looking for, the one or the what do they call the high value person or
Uh-huh.
there's all of these terms, but basically they all describe something that is not human.
And there's a status thing around that, right? Like if I find the one, that must have some kind of meaning about my status in life, about my accomplishments in life. If I find a partner who, provides social value to my life, then that must, create more status for me. Even in, I think, just the nature of coupling up, there's a level of social status that we get to enjoy when we present in the world as a couple versus as someone who's single. I always think of the Bridget Jones movies. There's this wonderful scene in the first movie where she's single and she's sitting at this table full of, she calls them the smug married couples in the book. And and there is like there's a lot of social privilege that comes in from being coupled. Yeah.
So that kind of brings me to this idea that we were talking a little bit about before we hit record, which was talking a little bit about the nuclear family.
Yeah.
First of all, when you say that, what does that mean?
So the nuclear family is, as a concept, it emerged after World War II. And it was predominantly something explored in North America to begin with. It was this idea that the perfect family is a man and a wife, and they're married, and they have, 2 or 3 kids. And in addition to that, they have a home that they own, and they have 1 or 2 cars, and they have their appliances, and they have the white picket fence, and it's that kind of like an American dream personified. And, some of that, in a way, it was like a kind of propaganda campaign because so many women had entered the workforce during World War II. And now the men were back from the war and they wanted the powers that be wanted women to be back in the home as homemakers. So it was a way to glamorize that. Also, all the appliances and all of that comes into that idea of like the 1950s housewife. A lot of those appliances were being made in factories from the wartime that were repurposed. So there was a lot of like this idea of the nuclear family is fueling industry, is creating more commerce, and is creating a bigger gender divide. It's putting women in the home and men in the workplace. And this is different from what happened in Europe. In Europe, a lot of women stayed in the workforce. But because of Hollywood, because of media, because of the prevalence of American storytelling, this idea of the nuclear family got exported around the world. So, for me, I grew up on the other side of the planet. I grew up like watching the sitcoms and watching these families and, unconsciously internalizing, right, this is what a family is supposed to be, even if it doesn't resemble what my family looks like. And there's still, we still hold on to this idea that this nuclear family is what's going to give us security and safety and stability. That, participating in the nuclear family is somehow makes us more valid as human beings. And we see that even in queer spaces, right? Queer relationships, we may not have those traditional gender roles, but there can still be a gravitation towards, well, we have to have our home and like we have to have this like little unit. And one of the things with the nuclear family is each of these units are kind of siloed away from each other, right?
Mm-hmm.
There isn't the resource sharing. There isn't the coming together in times of crisis. It's still like it's a form of individualism, right? It's every family unit for themselves. Our family is in competition with other families, rather than if we were in a village situation. We're all in this together. We are all different families, but we're also a village. We also have that identity as a relationship too.
I'm curious. I'd like to go back to what you were saying about queer families and queer dynamics, and I'm not exactly sure what the question is, but um,
Let's just unpack that a bit more, maybe.
yeah, let's just unpack that a little bit more.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting. Like, obviously, I'm a queer person. I'm non binary in my gender experience. I date people of all different genders. And one of the things I've noticed is for such a long time, the right for same sex marriage was such an important piece of queer rights. And it is an important piece. I think it's a marker of equity that queer people are not less than, that we can have the same rights as as heterosexual people. And also, um, that quest for marriage and validation and endorsement by the state. There's a level in there where it's like, are we then limiting ourselves in how we explore other relationships? Right? I mean, for a lot of queer people, maybe not so much now, but certainly historically, queer people faced loss of community of origin, right? The shame, the stigma around being gay, being lesbian, being trans might mean that someone loses their family, their blood relatives, the family that raised them when they come out. And so because of that, within queer spaces, there's a lot of chosen family.
Mm.
And I think we also have to acknowledge within that there is an influence of people of color. Queer people of color have been the leaders in queer rights. And a lot of people of color have stayed more connected to that idea of like, we're building community together. Because in the face of racism, in the face of marginalization, you have to stick together. And so within the queer community spaces, we see this emergence of chosen family, which is not necessarily any family that you're having as like legally recognized kin, right? They may not be able to be legally recognized kin. And it may not be that there's one single person who would be your next of kin, but that there's a community around you. And that chosen family is a lot closer to that idea of village, right? Often very intergenerational
Mhm.
to this day, and not limited to who we are having sexual or romantic relationships with.
Yeah, hearing you say that, I was speaking with a friend of mine earlier, and we were talking about the fairy community. Um,
Yeah,
and the male fairy community is very much looking at this point in time about um, how to care for the elders,
yeah,
because the elders are now starting to be in their 70s and their
yeah,
80s and needing care in ways that traditionally the family may have or may not have, supported the aging of family members. And
yeah,
so it's a really interesting conversation about a community really looking at, um, eh, being outside of what is the traditional, and how do we come together to support people who are outside of the traditional
yeah.
um, situation. I mean, I remember one of the big pieces around gay marriage was being able to make the medical decisions for your loved ones, being able to be there at the side of loved ones who were, ill and or possibly even transitioning.
Yeah.
So, being able to bring those pieces in thoughtfully and it's a very important part um, of the life cycle of, I think we often think about family when we're talking about like the raising of children.
Hmm.
Also, you want your people around you as your
Yeah.
ex-mate.
Yeah. And I think, one of the things that I've seen is for a lot of the time, some of those queer elders, they may not have had the ability to have children, given when they were coming into their queerness and what was available to them at the time, whether it's through surrogacy or adoption or IVF or something else, they wouldn't have had children. And in the nuclear family, it's the children who look after the elders. So there's no children, at least not of their own children to look after them. So, those of us who are queer, who maybe don't have a relationship with our parents, we might gravitate towards, okay, are there queer elders that I can support and help look after? Who do I feel that connection and that relationship with? And I think to extend that into all of us, not just the queer community. I mean, a lot of the time, I think people are still like, well, okay, this person can just go into the retirement home and we'll just visit them there. And there's a huge loss from that. I love seeing, retirement homes that have like a daycare attached to them. So the youth and the elders can interact because I think there's so much richness in that. And and I think that we gain so much from those relationships and from having those connections. I also think that there's space for, communities of elders to come together, and I've seen this happen. I know a group of folks in Seattle area who are very sex positive and I'd say very radical in the way they relate and create community. And I stayed in one of the houses that they had once, and I think the youngest person in this house, other than me, the house guest, was probably like in their mid 60s. And It was so sweet. Just like seeing all the care that there was between everybody in this household, but also seeing that they were having some pretty wild, incredible sex every night. Like I was like, I did not sleep last night because all I could hear was the moans. And that's really awesome.
Yeah, I hearing you say that, I mean, we have such a limited idea of what sex is, who it's for, you know, what it looks like, and when it starts and when it ends. And I love hearing that about, we have all of these different ways of being sexual, of being sensual, of bringing our eros into
Yeah.
play. And I just want to, before I forget this, I just wanted to go back for a second because as we were talking and you were saying, it's up to the children to take care of the parents. One of the things I'm really seeing in my uh, sort of group is the folks that now have, almost adult children, and their parents are failing, and so they're in the
Mhm.
situation of, caretaking on both ends. And again, without a whole lot of support.
Yeah. Without that village of support. Yeah, absolutely. I have a couple of friends who are in that position too. Um, and and they have a kid who just went off to university, and they have three parents who are elderly and having different health things, and it's like, oh, the caregiving never stops. Like we don't get to have a rest from this. And I mean, and there are people who I think are very good at connecting them with the community and getting resourced. But I think that the social structures that we have are not conducive. Like they really have to go against the grain to get that support. And I think that even when people are in that situation and they reach out and ask for help, we don't have enough social context for going, yeah, let's help because we love these people, because we want to support them. We get told that to ask for help, to ask for more than what we have, is to be selfish or is to admit some kind of weakness. And what I think is really beautiful, kind of bringing it back into non monogamy, is that within non monogamy, whatever way that you are exploring it, whether it's just sexual or whether you're looking at dating or building emotional relationships or platonic or whatever, there is something about it which is about building more meaningful connection with
Mm,
other people. And as we build more meaningful connection, if we're doing that in a healthy way, we cannot just ignore someone else's humanity, right? And if we are including a sexual space as part of that relationship, we're seeing the most vulnerable parts of each other. So when someone is in need, of course we're going to go, yeah, what capacity do I have to help you? Maybe I don't have a lot of capacity because I'm in crisis too, but let's figure that out. Maybe we can be in crisis together.
so curious. So when you start working with folks, like, where do you generally start? Um,
Yeah.
what's it like to work with you?
I mean, I have folks come to me when they're just starting to open up. I have folks come to me when they've kind of like, oh, we stumbled through and now we're running into issues. And I have folks come to me when they're like, it was going fine for 10 years and now we're stuck. Um, I love to work with folks, first of all, one on one. I'll only work with people as a group if it feels like it's going to be helpful and
Mhm.
supportive of the process. But working one on one, I'm really curious about what is the journey. That's the first thing I want to know is what is the journey? Um, there's three questions I'm always curious about. What kind of non monogamy are you wanting? Why is it that you want that? And where is it you want that to go?
Mm.
Like, what is your long term vision for this? And people may not have thought about those questions before, and that's okay. But we can explore what that is together. And from that, there's going to be answers that come up of like, oh, so if we know the answer to these questions is this, what are the decisions that need to be made? And I always tell people, I'm not the expert on you. Like, everybody has agency. Leave what doesn't work for you. Take what works for you. But I think exploring how we move out of that monogamous mindset is really important. So we start to pull apart. I think of it as, if we're just kind of winging it in non-monogamy, or we're walking into it going, oh, this is a lot and it's overwhelming, everything kind of feels like this tangled ball, right? It's all knotted up. And so a lot of what we're doing at first is just kind of picking apart, okay, what's in this tangled ball of feelings and desires and needs, and how I'm taking care from my partner, and how maybe I've abandoned my boundaries, or how I've tried to have control, or what my dream is for the future, or my fear about what my parents might think about this, right? We kind of pull that all apart. And as we pull things apart, it actually becomes easier to look at them all. And once we can look at them all, it's easier to just orient ourselves to, how do we relate to each of these pieces? And once we can relate to each of these pieces, the client gets to decide how they show up for that relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And I always tell people, I'm like, I'm here to guide you. I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'm going to offer you suggestions. I'm going to suggest reframings. But at the end of the day, I'm not here to tell you what to do. Because I think, nobody can tell you what to do. You really have to, it's about getting connected to your own inner truth and connected to that inner wisdom, so that inner wisdom is always with you, guiding you.
I recently saw a meme, and I think it was something along the lines of normalize exploring non-monogamy. And what I love about that is this idea that, you know, that we get to explore. Because I certainly know that my relationships and goals and the ways that they has changed over time, based on, who I am, who my partner is, who the people who joined us were, what their needs and desires were there expectations that we could, things that we could match and meet them on. So yeah, it's I think one of the other things I often see, and I'm curious if this is something you see, is I'll have people who, they're like, "Oh, I'm non-monogamous," and it's actually, well, that's one way of doing it, but it looks to me like you're just dating,
Right.
and this is how you give yourself permission to date, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. It's just kind of a funny thing.
So the way that I look at it is, I think the non-monogamous community has done a great job of finding lots of different labels and terms, and those are helpful up to a point. So I like kind of going into, how do we pull away the terms and just describe what's happening?
Mhm,
So if I'm describing what's happening, I look at it as, okay, if we're not just doing that default relationship escalator, where are we? We're
mhm,
actually in a relationship landscape. And in this landscape, there's different parts of the landscape, just like you have different parts of your garden. And there's a part of the garden that gets more sun, and there's a part of the garden that's shaded. And based on that, and based on the soil, different things are going to grow there, right? So in our relationship landscape, there's 4 quadrants. We have emotional relationships. We have social relationships. We have practical relationships, and we have erotic relationships. And we can have relationships that can exist in all 4 of these quadrants. We have relationships that might move from one to another. We might be like, I thought this relationship was going to work great in the social quadrant, but actually it's not working so great, but it still feels good in the emotional. So let's just transplant it, right? And and then we have relationships that's like, I don't know where this is going to go. And we kind of like try it in different spots until we find the right place. There are relationships that might be like a big old oak tree that are just like, yeah, this has always been there. I have one relationship in my life that's in my erotic quadrant predominantly. that's long distance, but it's been there since it's been there for over 20 years. And so I'm like, I know I can rely on this person. Person gets me. Do we have a romantic relationship? No. There's a limit to the emotional depth. And that's okay, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in each of these quadrants, we can explore different levels of depth. There might be different levels of trust. It is totally okay to say that you have a very, light social relationship with someone and you also sleep with them, right? That's a lovely casual friendship. That's we might call that friends with benefits, or that might be someone that you see if you go swinging, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't have to mean that it's not valid or part of your ecosystem. It's part of your ecosystem, right? And we can honor its place in your ecosystem. It's not trying to invade the space of your practical relationship where maybe you live with a spouse or two, or you're like, I'm not living with any partners because I'm raising my kids, or I have accessibility needs that mean I need to live alone. So, you can protect a quadrant sometimes as well. So I find that just thinking about it in terms of these quadrants kind of liberates us a little to kind of go, yeah, we can play with this and nothing is less valid. Nothing is meaningless. Everything is significant if I want it to be. And it's also great to just be able to honor we don't have to make more of a relationship than it needs to be.
Oh, I love that. I think that's one of the things that I see so often is it's like we enjoy each other's company and, but we are daisies together.
Yeah.
Um, and I really love the metaphor of the garden. So that's such a good one. But yeah, being real with what is between us, I think is such an important piece that we often miss. I think, going back to the escalator, two people meet, they go on a few dates. It's like, oh, it feels good to be in your presence. You know, we needed to go somewhere.
And to go back to what we were talking about with the nervous system, I think that though there's two things going on here. When we meet someone and we feel that spark, there's often a kind of hunger in our nervous system. There's a hunger in our relational connection because we don't have enough relational connection, right? We live in a world where so much is digital. Now we have AI coming in on top of that. And, it skews our experience of relationality. So when we meet someone in real life where we're like, whoa, I feel connection, there's a hunger. We're like, I want this. And so that's where we might go, yeah, I want to jump on that escalator. There's also a piece where to be in connection with someone new is absolutely terrifying. This person's a stranger. We don't know who they are. And so we will kind of leap ahead a little bit and we might create what I call the necessary fantasy. And that's just an imagining of the possibilities of, well, what's possible with this person? And we might fixate on that fantasy as a way to kind of create scaffolding for us
Mhm.
while we figure out what's actually possible. Sometimes we realize that it's scaffolding. Sometimes we don't. And sometimes, when the fantasy is challenged, I mean, we hope that the reality isn't going to be too different from the fantasy, but sometimes it is. And when it is very different, we might feel grief. We might feel upset. We might feel like, what am I doing with this person? And I think, when we hold too tightly onto the fantasy, we can sometimes set ourselves up for a lot of pain and heartache. But I think there's nothing wrong with having it in the first place.
I love that permission piece. It's so good.
I'm all about permission. I'm like, we're humans. We're messy. Somehow what we're doing makes sense to us. Let's unpack that.
Oh my goodness. Well, so what a great conversation, and I love all the different places we've gone. I am so curious. I'm going to give you a moment to just think about if there's one thing that you want people to get out of our conversation today, what might that be?
Mhm.
And while you're pondering that, I'm going to let people know how they can support the Better Sex podcast. Because, sex is a complex issue and it can make or break our relationships. And unfortunately, most of us don't get to have these kinds of open, honest conversations. And so I'd like to invite more conversations. So please, if you have any questions, concerns, you can shoot us an email at deborahcat@gmail.com. We love it when you interact with us in the comments section of wherever you get your podcasts, so please do so. And on that note, Mel, what have you got for us? What do you want people to know about sex and relationships?
I think the biggest piece is it's okay to let go of the grip that perfectionism has. Recognize where that perfectionism story may be coming from and know that it's not the only story. Human beings are messy. By nature, we are messy. And we are all messy human beings having perfectly messy human experiences. We don't have to go out of our way to look for mess. I think just to acknowledge that we're not quote unquote perfect. And I think what really matters is not, doing things in a perfect way, but how we recover if we do make something messy or we do make a mistake or we do go, oh gosh, there was a better way I could have done that. And I think to get into that space, we need to figure out how do we be more compassionate with ourselves and others, which is a lot about how we are connecting into that relationality in our nervous system.
Mm. So good. Thank you so much. And I know that you have a gift for folks. And for those who are listening to the Better Sex podcast, we get to benefit from Mel's generosity. Do you want to tell us a little about that?
Yeah. So it's a little ebook called Connection and Disconnected Times. And it just takes you through some exercises for you, either alone or with partners. Whenever you're going through times you're like, oh, we feel conflict or disconnected or things are awkward or weird or we're figuring things out. It's just a series of different exercises that you can sit down. And I always find it's helpful to have a piece of paper in front of me to be like, here's the thing. Let's just follow this. So it's just a little tool that folks can use to create a little more relationality and support together, even when times are hard.
Beautiful. Thank you. And there will be a link for that in the show notes. But tell us, where can we find more Mel?
So you can find me at radicalrelating.ca and you can find me on social media at radicalrelating. That's my handle on all social media platforms that I'm on. So Meta platforms, Blue Sky, etc. And then also September, my book, Radical Relating, is coming out through North Atlantic Books, and that'll be distributed through Penguin Random House. You can find full information about how to order that through your local independent bookstore on my website. Go to radicalrelating.ca, and I think it's just /book.
Oh my God! How did we not talk about that? I'm going to invite you back to talk about your book.
My book is going to talk about a lot of what we talked about here today.
Okay, good. Okay, good. All right. Well, thank you so much, Mel, for being a guest. For those of you who are listening, please follow them on social medias. Do you have a platform in particular that you're enjoying these days?
The one that I've been using the most is Instagram because I love visuals. I'm a very visual-oriented person, and I love the multimedia of that. But we'll see how the other ones go. I've kind of like finding time to like learn other platforms. It's a bit of an edge for me, but we'll get there.
I hear you. I hear you. Well, thank you so much. Please follow them on the socials. And if you know somebody who is thinking about non-monogamy and you feel like this conversation would help them, please pass this on. Please pass this around. And if you want to help do your part for a safer and sexy world, like, subscribe, and leave a comment. So thank you again, Mel, for joining me.
Thank you. It's been an absolute delight.
Oh, I love hearing that. All right. Bye for now.